Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias and bom dia. So I'm working on it. I just wanted to tell you a little more about myself. No, I'm joking. We're going to get underway because we started a little late because you took so long to get here. But thank you for coming, especially because it's day 3. And as Professor Xavier said, we're all tired. I think I already introduced myself. Okay, before I introduce the speakers, usually we should do this at the end of a meeting, but maybe we could do this now, especially because we're talking about migration. Are folks familiar with a unity clap? Anyone? Okay, so just to help warm up the space, because we're so tired, we'll just start clapping very slow. You can follow my tempo and then we'll speed up until it ends in an exclamation of joy. Okay? I gotta put the mic down for that. I slowly. Okay, thank you. I hope you're more awake now. I'm shaking with awakeness. I have partly because of the migration context, like where I learned about the clap is from farm workers, especially I think in the American context, Filipino farm workers and Latin American farm workers, and then also migrant workers in the Canadian context coming from Mexico and the Caribbean and elsewhere as well. So at the end of different meetings, like organizers and the farm workers will clap to conclude. We're doing it out of order, but just to help wake us up. Okay, so our first speaker is João Roriz, assistant professor at the Federal University of Goiás, Brazil, and coordinator of the Sergio Vieira de Mello Chair at UFG. João is interested in international law, human rights, and migration, mainly from a critical and historical perspective. And then our second speaker will be Juan Manuel Amaya Castro. We ran out of space on the slide, but just don't forget the last name. Associate Professor, Faculty of Law here at Universidad de los Andes, Colombia. His research explores law's role in the global political economy with a geographic sensibility and a focus on global supply chains, migration, and questions of political economy, citizenship, and technology. I got into John Reynolds' bio at the end there. I feel like you both like political economy, so that's okay. All right, so João, we'll start with you. You have some slides. I'm going to move to the side so you can see them for about 25 minutes. Then we'll switch over to Juan, and then we'll do some Q&A. Okay.
Buenos dias, bom dia, good morning. This is a painting of Dias do Nascimento, a great Afro-Brazilian intellectual whose work I think should be more known. Well, I would like to thank the invitation to be here in this Chévere city. I also would like to thank Amar for chairing this panel and the whole TWAILR review team for organizing this amazing event. And if you excuse me, I would like to take this opportunity and thank a very special person who has dedicated a lot of critical thinking in Brazil and who is kind of the head of the Brazilian gang here, Fábia Fernandes Carvalho. She's the best encounter I had during my PhD years and became a very dear, dear friend. Whoever knows Fábia is familiar with her contagious energy, sangue nos olhos, and how she takes that to her writing and speaking. And the privileged ones who come to know her better become familiar that such passion comes along with an ocean of kindness and love for what she does. Thank you for everything, Fábia. So my presentation is based on some fragments of research experiences with refugees and other migrants in Brazil. They are from 3 different researchers with their own questions, objectives, methodologies, and so on. They were all conducted in Goiânia, the capital state of Goiás, the center of Brazil, between 2019 and 2021. Next slide. They are part of a broader initiative called Sérgio Vieira de Mello, which I won't go too much into detail here, but it is an agreement between UNHCR and several universities in Brazil. Currently, there are more than 30 universities participating in this chair. It's a kind of a hub that congregates teaching, research, and extension regarding refugee and migrants. At my home university, the Sérgio Vieira de Mello Chair is, it's a hub for projects such as Portuguese language courses for migrants, healthcare initiatives, legal and administrative consulting, affirmative actions to facilitate admission into the university, diploma revalidation, and others. These are all cost-free initiatives directed not only to refugees, but also to migrants in general. Next slide, please. But before we go into the stories, I would like to reflect on some theoretical issues. The fundamental basis of how international law governs individuals who cross borders lies in these distinctions, in this distinction, which you can't see. Thank you. So refugees on one hand and migrants on the other. This pair not only shapes the norms and institutions that label people, but also serve as a moral compass through which they are judged and cared, and sometimes not cared of for. The refugee-migrant pair influences news coverage, political discussions, and even academic research, as highlighted by B.S. Chimney's work on the geopolitics of the knowledge production in the field. Critical literature demonstrates the colonial origins of this pair. More or less during the context of the 1951 convention, there were millions of people outside Europe who were displaced. Next slide. Some estimate that around 14 million people were dislocated during the partition of India in the late 1940s. Next one. Almost half of the Palestinian population had to flee their homes during the 1948 Arab-Israeli war. Next one. About 7 million people were displaced during the Korean War in the early 1950s. The list could go on. We know that these displacements are the result of interventions and colonial practices. Next one, please. If we do what Edward Said named contrapuntal analysis, that is a set of intertwined and overlapping histories, if we arrange this history side by side with the 1951 convention, we see clearly how this was by design limited to Europe and the refugee label to Europeans. The pair refugee-migrant was constructed as oppositions. Once someone is labeled a refugee, her situation is ruled by norms, institutions, and a moral logic that is historically fabricated to differentiate her from another migrant. I will refrain from delving deeper into the colonial origins of refugee law and studies. Next slide, please. For my purposes here, I would like to emphasize the underlying premise of such opposing pair. According to it, migrants and refugees are believed to have unique and identifiable motivations for crossing borders. The premise implies that people migrate for two different sets of reasons, and that is feasible for a government to establish an organized system that effectively and fairly categorize migrants and enables accurate predictions. What are some of the consequences of such premises? Next. Within this categorization process, the adjective used to describe the refugees' migration is forced, while the one used with migrants is voluntarily. There are also consequences regarding their motives. Next one. Refugees are presumed to flee their home countries due to political reasons, while migrants are seen as driven by economic factors. This gives rise not only to different legal frameworks, but also shapes social perceptions. Next one. Refugees are deemed deserving of protection and care, while migrants may be perceived as potential threats to society and should be criminalized. So I do not question the critical reading about this refugee-migrant pair, and I agree that this dichotomy creates exclusion and violent practices. However, 2 days ago, Usha Natarajan told us that it is part of TWAILR approach to complicate issues and to go beyond binaries. This fits well with my intentions here today, because I think that the refugee-migrant opposition sometimes darkens our views on a number of issues. I will use these 3 short fragments that add some kind of nuance and complexity to these binaries. The first is about a migrant or a refugee getting a job. The other 2 are, in the other 2, the refugee label couples with other social markers of difference, such as sexual orientation and racism, and becomes a vulnerability, not a protection. Next. The first story is about how we label migrants. The fragments here are from some semi-structured interviews we collected after providing legal assistance at the Sergio Vieira de Mello Chair in my home university. The 2 women are Laura from Venezuela and Marta from Bolivia. At the time of the interview in 2020, they just arrived in Goiânia and they were seeking legal counseling. These are the fragments. So some options. I could apply for the refugee visa or the humanitarian visa. I think I prefer the humanitarian visa because I was told it's faster and I could find a job. I don't like the idea of refugee, but I don't mind if I'm going to be classified. I just want to work and pay my bills. My friend told me that when an employer sees that one is a refugee, he thinks that maybe this person did something wrong in the other country. I'm not a criminal. You know, I don't like that. I want the easy way to get a job. So Laura from Venezuela. The other fragment. I don't understand the difference between me and the Venezuelan woman who was interviewed before. I also fled my country, Bolivia, because I had not much to eat and I want to give a better life to my children. Why are we, Marta and the other Venezuelan woman, different? What do I have to say to get my papers and start working? To fully explain this fragment, I would have to go into very much the detail of the Kafkanian bureaucracy regarding the migration regime in Brazil, and I won't have time to do that. Next slide. I just want to point that the Brazilian legislation on refugees is considered advanced. It includes the Cartagena Declaration about massive and generalized violation of human rights, and as you can see in the 3rd paragraph here. Next one, please. Recently, UNHCR published the consolidation of the total of refugees in Brazil. I'm not sure you can see it, but it states that there are 65,000 refugees, and then that 70 more or less % of them are from Venezuela, or about 53,000 people. Next one. However, many migrants, especially from Venezuela, are not applying for refugee status, and many remain with other visas, such as the humanitarian one. We don't have the consolidated official number of humanitarian visas in Brazil, but given the number of Venezuelan registered in this social program specific here, which is 242,000, we can have an idea that most Venezuelans either do not apply for the refugee status or do not have it recognized. So the Brazilian government created this humanitarian visa, first given to Haitians in 2011. Since then, it has been used to include Venezuelans, Afghans, and recently Ukrainians. There is some technical difference, which I won't go into detail here, but it's sufficient to say that the humanitarian visa is not regulated by a proper law, but it's like administrative orders, and it's always directed to one specific nationality, and has a time constraint as well. It differs from the asylum seeker procedure, as the migrant can apply for this specific visa from abroad, and formally, both a refugee and a migrant with a humanitarian visa are allowed to regular work and can access social services. However, as Laura's stories tell us, we are witnessing some discrimination regarding refugees when it comes to work, and unfortunately, it's not an isolated case. Laura's natural concern was with her everyday life, not with this international law vocabulary. She didn't want to be labeled as a refugee because of a negative social imagination about it. She just wanted to work. Martha's anxieties, on the other hand, is also about someone who wants to work. Her question, why are we different, brings down to earth and summarizes what a literature has spent hundreds of pages analyzing. While she sees no difference between her motivation and the others, her question does imply the injustice of legal fictions that end up regulating them differently. The second story is part of a research postgraduate student and I conducted on the role of temporary accommodations in the integration of LGBT refugees in Brazil and Germany. The research involved semi-structured interviews with 25 LGBT refugees. I want to tell about the findings very briefly. In both countries, Brazil and Germany, there is a certain feeling of insecurity in these accommodations. However, in Germany, the interviewees reported higher levels of discrimination inside the accommodation provided by the government. In Germany, there is no distinction on gender and sexual orientation inside the accommodations. Hence, an LGBT refugee could be placed in a hostile environment. In Brazil, on the other hand, there are some temporary accommodations specifically designed for LGBT refugees, provided not by the government, but by civil society organizations with public funding. But once the LGBT refugees leave the temporary accommodations and start living in regular places, the opposite happens. While the refugees in Germany felt more secure regarding their sexual orientation and gender inside the accommodations, the Brazilians were afraid outside the accommodations. Okay, but enough of Germany. Next slide. In Brazil, all interviewed LGBT refugees were open about their sexual orientation and gender inside the accommodations. And they highlighted its positive features: security, hospitality, and a place free of discrimination. The answers differed significantly regarding discrimination or violence outside the accommodations. So a participant told us that was at night, about 9:10 at night, a lesbian and 3 gay, all Venezuelans. And the lesbian was going to buy a box of cigarettes, and we went. When we were coming back, the police patrol came and they stopped us and they told us to put our hands on the back of our heads, and they called us refugee faggots. Things like that. And they also burned her hand with a cigarette, and then they hit her in the hip. They were going to hit her again, but she said, no, I'm carrying, that is, she was pregnant, so he stopped. Here the refugee label was associated with a homophobic term. There are 2 levels of discrimination that together inform the violent act. It is clear that the refugee status did not invoke protection from a public authority whose job is precisely public security. Not protection, quite the opposite. The police officer knew they were refugees. They knew they were vulnerable as such. In legal matters, Brazil has greatly advanced in rights of the LGBT population in the last years. We had recognition of same-sex marriages, and in 2019, the Supreme Court decided that discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity is a crime. However, the main problem in Brazil is not about legislation. Although Brazil does not have official statistics on violence against LGBT people, there are reports that place the country with the highest death rate of LGBT people in the world. I'm going to repeat that. Highest death rate of LGBT people in the world. Last year, Casa Amiga, an NGO from Bahia, indicated that 237 LGBT persons were victims of deaths precisely because they were LGBT. The record year, 2017, just before Bolsonaro's election, we had 445 deaths. we don't have data on LGBT refugees. So the final story is part of a research regarding urbanism and migration and how migrants live and react to the politics of public mobility. This research is in its early stages, and it involves a team of undergrad and graduate students who are trying to map how fragmental is the social interactions of migrants in the city. So we were interviewing members of a small community of Haitians, and although we were not asking direct questions about race and racism, the topic came up many times. Sorry, next slide. This is a fragment of an interview with André, 28 years old. He and his son, who is 7 years old, have been living in Goiânia since 2014. André works irregularly as a construction worker, an unstable and underpaid position. At the time of the interview, he was struggling to find a permanent job. He was also selling candies in the streets of the city. So André says, I always say thank you, obrigado, to the people of the city. I met a lot of happy people here, just like back home in Haiti. We enjoy dancing and singing. He makes a gesture with his hand to indicate a smile. But there are also bad things. We have been discriminated against because we are Black. I had trouble buying a present at the shopping mall. Once they did not let me buy a toy for my son, the security guard kept following me and asked me to leave, or he would call the police, and I had money. But the worst day was when my son got beaten at school. The other kids called him dirty and stinking Black. They told him he should leave Brazil forever. He did not receive proper care at the school, and I had to carry him to the hospital. I didn't know that a 7-year-old could break a nose. The interviewer asks, did you report this case to the police? André says, no. Why not? André's reply, because we are refugees. There is a lot to unpack in André's story, but I would like to highlight this fragment as it shows the clash of his initial feeling of gratitude with a blunt case of racism and xenophobia. His difficulty in finding a proper and permanent job and his experiences with Brazilian violent racism, especially regarding his son, affected his perception as a migrant and as a person entitled with rights. In another part of the interview, André recognized the importance of refugee protection when they arrived in Brazil. However, such protection waned when facing other markers of, other social markers of difference, such as race. Like the issue of LGBT protection, racism is well regulated under Brazilian law. Under the Constitution, the practice of racism constitutes a non-bailable crime without statutes of limitations subject to imprisonment. So in criminal law, it is a category of heinous crime, which means it is not subject to grace, pardon, or amnesty, bail, and provisional freedom. And there are lots of public policies, although many of them were kind of put aside during the Bolsonaro years, but it's also not a matter of legislation. So to my final remarks, there is a strong critical literature on the political and legal basis of labeling people who migrate and the production of knowledge associated with it. The first story, the Venezuelan and the Bolivian women, gives a hint on the politics of labeling migrants and how it can direct their lives. There are many pairs or binaries associated with it: legal, illegal, politically motivated, economically motivated, harmless, dangerous, citizen, foreigner, friend, enemy. The pair refugee migrant is a construction informed by international legal arguments that separates the one who deserves protection from the others who could be a threat. But with these stories I told you in my mind, I think there is more into it. First, it seems obvious, but nonetheless increasingly necessary, that we need to talk more about the others, the migrants. The legal fiction that separates refugees and migrants has to be further questioned. Such pair is very efficient at obscuring the ways in which legal categories have been constructed over time to elevate the suffering of some over the suffering of others. And there is a lot of research. On this agenda, and I think the TWAILR movement has a very rich contribution. And we must include the migrants who are not refugees in the crisis of international solidarity that Obiora Okafor told us about. Secondly, the refugee label can also mean vulnerability in the face of precarious work conditions and other social markers of difference. The Venezuelan in the first fragment didn't want a job, didn't want to be labeled a refugee because she believed it could jeopardize her chances of getting a job. The LGBT phobia on the second story reveals the contrast of a society who has the world's largest gay parade in the world, in São Paulo, with the country that has the highest death rate of LGBT people. The promise of a safe environment to the refugee who fled persecution based on his sexual orientation stops when he leaves the temporary accommodation and starts living in regular places. Finally, the literature usually points that refugee is not an identity, but a state of affairs, or that it could be a forged identity in the othering processes. But Andre's words, because we are refugees, are stuck in my mind whenever I think about this issue. It is not despite his status as a refugee, but because of it, that Andre does not see himself as someone who could go to a police station and report a crime against his son. Here, the label, the one who deserves protection, is reversed in the face of racism. So, these are the fragments I wanted to show you. Can you just pass the other one? There's a lot I could talk about the chair. We are kind of being informed by these research activities and developing specific actions within the community. This is one of the events we did recently, including racism and xenophobia as the main topics of the national event of the chairs. But I think I'm on my time, and I know Amar is very strict on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, João. Thank you so much. And perfectly on time also. Juan, take it away.
Yep, thank you. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers, the collective. It's really been amazing. I really feel inspired and mobilized by your collective effort. It's also been great to read some of the papers and some of the work that the so-called younger scholars have been doing, and it's been interesting to sort of like really submerge myself in this writing process, especially because I've been having a lot of hard time deciding what to say today. And I've come to the conclusion that the linearity that we are, your mentors demand of you in your written work is a horrible bourgeois, Eurocentric thing to despise. However, well, it does serve a function, but in any case, so if I'm a bit baroque, just blame it on Europe. I want to especially thank Sujit for making the hosts here feel uncomfortable. There we go. Linearity, it's such a challenge. With your challenge to acknowledge the displacement of originary peoples or indigenous peoples here. And I think this discomfort, I've tried to adopt it as a type of a pleasure, which is a very decadent thing to do, but I actually have been wanting to take it seriously, although it does produce resistances, as you have already witnessed. Like, this is just another example of, go to Canada, but don't let Canada come to you. As we say about mining companies, is this like a Canadian thing? Our colonial histories are different, that kind of thing. And I acknowledge that is a resistance. And that resistance is trying to cover up, is reacting to a moral interpellation that produces a degree of shame or guilt. And so I want to give my own sort of like twist, so to appropriate that. And so I want to acknowledge that this is a closed campus with guards that have dogs, and that our beautiful campus has been expanding from there to this part of town, and has plans to further do urban renewal in all this area that you see. So all of these houses, these humble dwellings that you see below, they're going to disappear. There's going to be some high-rise, and the university, to be fair, does want this to be responsible urban renewal, and so renewal. And so they do want to provide housing for the people here, but whatever there is in terms of a community is going to disappear. And the people living there didn't ask for urban renewal. And the people living a bit higher up, they don't have valid legal property titles, and so they are going to be evicted. And so I want to acknowledge that displacement, which follows other displacements, joins a long list of displacement, all the way to the indigenous people that first arrived here. And I promise that I will always follow Sujit's example, in the sense that I will study present and past displacements of the places where I work and live. Although I don't know if I'm going to ask the host that invite me for dinner, so who was displaced here where you live? Now your dinner, by the way. Displacement seems to be the name of the game. And migration and displacement is the name of this panel, this table. I've worked on the topic of migration. I stopped working on the topic of migration after working that topic for about 6-7 years in Amsterdam at the Free University as a postdoc. I hadn't worked the topic of migration, even though it was always a bit appealing to me, since I grew up in the Netherlands as a migrant, as a child of a migrant mother. My first encounter, so I had just finished my PhD, and I was sort of like interested. So what do you do actually when you do law and migration? What do you do? What is it that legal scholarship and migration is about? And what I saw was a series of titanic efforts dealing with a lot of cases of different European courts or constitutional courts or Supreme Courts, but they would basically, in terms of like the ideological battlefield, it would be about inches. It would be the Battle of the Somme, trench warfare, struggles in order to, in playing the labeling game that João has just given us an example. With very, very dramatic stories, but I felt that like the big questions were somehow not being caught in the labeling game, which is a very legal game, so what exactly is voluntary, what exactly is coerced, what is your identity exactly. So it also forces all kinds of systems on people. So what you witness a lot is, refugees, they arrive, and other migrants as well, they arrive in places and they're sort of like trying to figure out, so what is my actual role here? How can I game the system? Which identity do I need to perform? What is the story that you want me to tell you? And this is not just for refugees, this is even me growing up as a migrant, trying to, be accepted in some ways. So how do I perform Dutchness in the best possible way? How do I avoid the pitfalls, even though I have the advantage of the color of my skin in the Dutch context? As soon as I mentioned my name, the question, where are you from? And then I need to start, this performance. So it resonated a bit too much, like I don't want to play that labeling game. I don't want to, even though it may make some people's lives better, it just doesn't, it's not something that I want to do to myself. And so I started doing history, history of citizenship, history of territoriality. So that's where my interest in geography came from. And so one of the things that you learn is that, the existing migration control regime, as I call it, started not so long ago. It's, it took shape after World War I, as states, especially in Europe, were scrambling with enormous flows of people moving around. But it was actually already taking a bit shape in the end of the 19th century, in particular in the United States, with the arrival not just of people from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, who were generally welcome, because states at that time, demography meant, population growth meant, and immigration meant more people to farm, more people to work in factories, more people to mobilize for your army. I mean, Mexico lost all of these states, in the Pacific coast to the United States because it could not populate them. Okay, and so population growth meant state power, national power. This changed when suddenly a lot of Chinese started to come into the United States, and then that's when you start seeing a construction of the immigrant as somebody who might be a problem, a pollutant, etc. Right now, by the way, I stopped working migration, but I'm working due diligence legislation and global value chains. And it's interesting, there's so many similarities. I mean, basically Colombia is trying to get its exports to enter European markets. Does that sound familiar? And now it's difficult because European markets are imposing sanitary measures. This is exactly how it started with the Chinese. It started with sanitary measures. And so there are eerie similarities. And so that's where the TWAILR sensibility starts to awaken. You start seeing very clearly a core periphery structure. You start seeing the a center that wants certain things and that wants to take certain things, and a periphery that's somehow beholden to that, is caught in that relation. Please take our bananas, please take our migrants, even though there is no external policy for please take our migrants. But I arrived in Colombia 7 years ago, started working here. After this postdoc, was more interested in pursuing law and geography, but the Venezuelan crisis happened, and suddenly you start seeing a lot of people coming here. And in the Colombian context, there was no migration. There was no migration legislation. There was no immigration legislation. There were a couple of secondary laws, decrees and stuff. Migration was dealt with by our Colombian FBI, so it was very much like a national security thing. And so I've witnessed up close the development of a modern migration state with a migration agency and migration rules and a more sophisticated visa regime, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there you see the globalization of this migration regime. A state has to somehow control who comes in, who comes out, etc. And they learn from each other, and the IOM offers courses, and Colombia can send people, agents, to learn how to classify and how to organize this, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, because I had been already working from a critical TWAILR perspective on this topic, I could very much see this molding of a post-colonial migration controlling state. Of course, tropical style. So less fantasies about control, less of a political prize when basically the state goes, well, there's nothing really we can do to stop these people, so we have to somehow deal with them, which would be an unthinkable position politically in the global north. There we must uphold, no matter what the cost, no matter how big the lies, no matter how many people die, no matter anything, we must uphold the fantasy that we can control immigration. Okay, Wendy Brown has written a beautiful book about this, about walls, as a performance more than as an actual effective mechanism. By the way, since February 1922, more people have lost their lives crossing the Mediterranean by a factor of at least 3, because that's the numbers that we know, than civilians in the war in Ukraine. Okay, so, and this, of course, is a news item that comes flying by and people just go on with their lives. Okay, so the naturalization of the human price that is paid for this fantasy of migration control is an ongoing thing. And one of the things when I started getting involved in migration, I used to also have my own fantasies, my own probably liberal fantasies that we have to humanize. We have to wage a cultural battle to humanize migrants. We have to produce movies and stories and books that show that these people are human. And then I discovered that there is already a huge amount of that. Okay, it just doesn't have impact. And there's very little in cultural context, in movies, or there's very little in dehumanization, but the dehumanization somehow is already there. The xenophobia, the racism, the the apodophobia, as a Spanish scholar has called it, the fear of poverty is there. Which takes me back to Bogotá. I see Bogotá as a place where, I see it in many of my students who come through the, through the mountains, come here, and then they leave back. They don't go down into the city center because it's scary. It's filled with poor, homeless people. They lock themselves up in their fancy neighborhoods and in their closed areas, and they go to their clubs or to their fincas, their holiday farms, etc. They don't. I mean, nobody likes to see poor people. I mean, I don't think even poor people like to see poor people. But and so it's a structural thing, okay? It's not just north-south. Every city is segregated along these lines, along these racialized caste lines. There are all kinds of subtle forms and less subtle forms by which we impose this order and we participate in that, and we all want to climb that order. And so I think that that's important. And so, I did a lot of work on citizenship, and a lot of citizenship theory is, so this is a citizen, and these are non-citizens or lesser citizens. Now, for me, citizenship is about that whole picture. It is about not kind of like the ideal type subject. It is about the differentiation that happens. And so there, I think, is a task for TWAILR to acknowledge that we are talking about, we already have, it is a global migration regime that we have that is decentralized. Okay, a passport is an international document given to you by a local authority that, sure, it develops its own criteria, but they all are very similar. And the migration control regime doesn't just want to keep people out. It wants to select. It's not about exclusion. It's about selective exclusion. So the Canadians have refined that system into this point system. And they're open about it. We want people with human capital. And this year we want this human capital. And 3 years later, we want this type of human capital. We want more nurses, more accountants, more engineers, whatever. They have made that into a very refined system. But most states somehow, even I find myself trying to argue in favor of a more fluid, more easy, more accessible migration control regime in Colombia by saying, like, don't we want those investors to come? Don't we want the tourists to come? Don't we want those foreign students and professors to come? So I'm part of that as well. Okay, so once we acknowledge that this is a structural and global, that this is something that happens at the very local level, here at the Universidad de los Andes, but I'm sure in all of the places where we are from, and at the most global level, then we can start to entertain this crazy idea, of global citizenship. Okay, and I think there's another task for TWAILR. Like, can we conceptualize an actual existing global citizenship? Existing in the sense, citizenship has different dimensions. One of them is this sense of belonging, the sense of connection, identity, etc. Another one is a kind of like the ideological one, like a liberal citizenship is different from a neoliberal citizenship in the sense of, you have to be a self-reliant, entrepreneurial subject, blah, 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 etc. So there's this ideological one. But there's another one, there's the bureaucratic. There's the actual, documented, materially manifesting one, where some people face an obstacle race, like some of our colleagues who couldn't make it here. Whereas others, I have the Dutch nationality as well as the Colombian, and I get annoyed when I have to fill out some form for, yes, ESTA or whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, there is a differentiation that in itself is this global citizenship that I'm talking about. By the way, I was incited by the Colombian state to come back. I'm a weird migrant. I'm one of the, they call the return migrant. And there was an actual policy by the Colombian state. And colloquially, I'm referred to as a repatriated brain, which I cannot say without thinking of zombie movies, by the way. Put that on your list. A repatriated brain. So, because, like, there you go again, there's the brain drain that is part of the whole global supply chain. We supply brains. We make enormous efforts in educating people, and then they end up in academic institutions or in fancy law firms or in companies in the global north. And so I think we need to pay more attention to this idea of an actual material bureaucratic global citizenship. Interestingly enough, and I want to just end it there, because Amar asked us to read Okafor, and Okafor talks about solidarity, and I'm like, and especially when he's like talking about solidarity as like something that has been diminishing, I'm like, really? Did it ever exist? I'm very, very skeptical about solidarity. I'm more hopeful about political struggle, and there I think we can learn something from the right. There's this identitarian movement in Europe and other places where you have people fighting for national identity and against globalization, against immigration, etc. But I follow some of them on Twitter, and sometimes I try to ask snotty questions, but then they block me immediately. But you find them in Japan, in Canada, in the United States, etc. So there's this fascinating strategic alliance, a mutual identification. You can argue that is already a form of global citizenship, and we shouldn't have any illusions about this global citizenship of the future. Almost done. It's not going to be harmony. It's going to be agonism. It's going to be struggle. It's going to be ideological divide. You will have people with different ideas about how this global community should look like. But so we are an example of a TWAILR sensitive global citizenship in the making, in a sense of identity and commitment. But I think the people on the right are, they have an advantage here, and we should learn from them. In that sense, I don't know exactly what we should learn from them, except that it is a priority that we build that. But there will be no, it's hard enough to have national solidarity or solidarity at the national level. So there will not be international solidarity without a sense of mutual belonging. And finally, there seems to be also this presupposition that climate change is going to produce millions of refugees, and everybody thinks that it's going to be people from the poor countries going to the rich countries. Where do you get that idea from? I mean, we have no idea where people will live and where to. So we should also keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Also, I just was thinking about your repatriated brain, but thank you so much for the presentation.